The First Battle of Newbury was a battle of the First English Civil War that was fought on the 20th of September 1643 between a royalist army, under the personal command of King Charles, and a parliamentarian force led by the Earl of Essex. Following a year of royalist successes in which they took Banbury, Oxford and Reading without conflict before storming Bristol, the parliamentarians were left without an effective army in the field. When Charles laid siege to Gloucester, Parliament was forced to muster a force under Essex with which to beat Charles's forces off. After a long march, Essex surprised the Royalists and forced him away from Gloucester before beginning a retreat to London. Charles rallied his forces and pursued Essex, overtaking the parliamentarian army at Newbury and forcing them to march past the Royalist force to continue their retreat. Essex reacted by making a surprise attack on the Royalist lines at dawn, capturing several pieces of high ground and leaving Charles on the back foot. A series of Royalist attacks led to large number of casualties and the slow retreat of Essex's force, which was driven from the central hill and almost encircled. Essex succeeded in rallying his infantry, however, and pushed forward in a counter-attack. The slowing of this counter-attack in the face of the Royalist cavalry forced Essex to send for reinforcements, who, while marching to him, were attacked and forced to retreat. This left a hole in the parliamentarian line, dividing the army into two wings through which the Royalists hoped to pass, splitting the parliamentarians and allowing Charles's troops to encircle and defeat the enemy. In line with this, the Royalists moved forward to press the attack, but were forced to halt by the London-trained bands. With night falling, the battle ended, and both exhausted armies disengaged. The next morning, low on ammunition, the Royalists were forced to allow Essex to pass and continue his retreat to London. Reasons for the Royalist defeat include shortage of ammunition, the relative lack of professionalism of their soldiers and the tactics of Essex, who compensated for his much-lamented paucity of cavalry by tactical ingenuity and firepower, countering Rupert's cavalry by driving them off with mass infantry formations. Although their numbers of casualties were relatively small, historians who have studied the battle consider it to be one of the most crucial of the First English Civil War, marking the high point of the Royalist advance and leading to the signing of the Solemn League and Covenant, which brought the Scottish Covenanters into the war on the side of Parliament and led to the eventual victory of the parliamentarian cause. Background: after the failure of parliamentarian forces to gain a conclusive victory at the Battle of Edge Hill in 1642, the Royalist armies had advanced on London, capturing Banbury, Oxford and Reading without conflict. On the 13th of November they faced the Earl of Essex at the Battle of Turnham Green, with Charles's advisers persuading him to retreat to Oxford and Reading. After Essex besieged Reading and Charles's armies failed in their attempts to relieve the town, a stalemate occurred on the front. Essex's army could not directly engage with the Royalists at Oxford due to disease in the ranks, while Charles was prevented from advancing due to the exhaustion of supplies and ammunition after the failed expedition to Reading. Despite this setback, the war was turning increasingly in favour of the Royalists. The early months of 1643 saw a crushing defeat of the parliamentarians at the Battle of Adwalton Moor, while the Battle of Roundway Down left Parliament without an effective army in the west of England, the lack of which allowed the Royalists under Prince Rupert to storm Bristol with the Western Army and Oxford Army. The result was that parliamentarian forces were depleted and appeared to be losing. Essex's army was the only significant one left in the field, and it suffered from reduced morale due to the defeats inflicted on Parliament by Royalist forces elsewhere in the war. Bristol. Despite this, Royalist forces were significantly depleted by the battle at Bristol, suffering over 1,000 men dead, and having exhausted their supplies, the armies were forced to regroup. Even considering this, the capture of Bristol is considered the high-water mark for the Royalist cause during the First English Civil War. With the city captured, however, an immediate dispute occurred over who was to govern it. and this led to Charles travelling there on the 1st of August to take personal command of the Royalist forces. Upon arriving, he called his Council of War together to discuss their next move, the primary questions at hand being, first, whether the armies should be united, and march in one upon the next design, and then, what the design should be. The Western Army, although still strong, refused to advance further to the east due to the presence of parliamentarian forces within Dorset and Cornwall. The army's commanders felt that, if they tried to push for such a move, their forces would either mutiny or simply desert. Because of this unrest, it was quickly resolved that the Western Army would remain an independent fighting force and remain in Dorset and Cornwall to mop up the remaining parliamentarians. Accordingly, the Western Army, commanded by Lord Carnarvon, remained in the region, capturing Dorchester in a bloodless victory on the 2nd of August. Prince Maurice left 1,200 infantry and approximately 200 cavalry to garrison Bristol before marching to Dorchester and personally taking command. The greater issues were what to do with the Oxford army and what the next design of the Royalist campaign would be. Rupert's strategy was to advance through the Severn Valley and capture Gloucester, which would allow Royalist forces in South Wales to reinforce Charles's army and thus allow for an assault on London. Another faction, however, argued that London could be captured with the army as it was, and that Gloucester would serve as a distraction from the main goal of the campaign. By the 6th of August, it was clear that Rupert's strategy would be abandoned. Instead, an alternate means of capturing the city was considered. During the early stages of the war, the loyalty of combatants on both sides, particularly that of professional soldiers, had been flexible. Gloucester was led by Edward Massey, a non-partisan mercenary who only took a job with the parliamentarians after he was refused a significant Royalist command. At the same time, it was felt that there was a strong, if so far silent, party of Royalist sympathisers in the city. While the governor of Sudeley Castle was reporting that Gloucester's soldiers had stated they would not resist a Royalist advance. Given this, the Council of War decided to march on Gloucester, not to besiege it or capture it by force, but to capture it by having the governor betray the city beforehand. William Legge, who had served with Massey in the Bishops' Wars, contacted him and asked him to surrender Gloucester to his lawful sovereign. Although this message was rebuffed, Legge's messenger reported that he had met Massey a second time in secret, and had been asked to tell Legge that Massey was willing to surrender the town to the king. As a result of this, on the 7th of August, Charles and the Oxford army marched to Gloucester. Charles's main force began marching on the 7th of August and reached the village of Painswick a day later. However, Rupert's cavalry screen had already advanced and taken the village. Charles himself did not accompany the force, but instead rode across the Cotswolds to Rendcombe, where he met reinforcements from Oxford on the 9th of August. On the morning of the 10th of August, the Royalist army marched to Gloucester itself and besieged the city with approximately 6,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry. With the force assembled, Charles sent a group of heralds, escorted by 1,000 musketeers, forward at approximately 2 p.m., at which point they read out the king's demands to a meeting of 26 local council and garrison officers, including Massey. The king's announcement was that if the officers submitted, he would pardon all the officers, prohibit his army from causing any damage to the city, and leave only a small garrison behind. If they did not, he would take the city by force, and the inhabitants would be responsible for all the calamities and miseries that must befall them. Despite earlier claims that Massey would surrender, he did not. A short time later, a refusal of the offer was drawn up and unanimously signed by the officers. The reasons for Massey's failure to surrender the city, despite the feelers he put out to Royalist contacts, are unknown. At this point, Charles called another council of war to discuss the situation. It was resolved that it was crucial that Gloucester was still to be taken, if it was left in parliamentarian hands. It would act as a break in lines of communication should the Royalists advance further east towards London. In addition, Charles's personal reputation had been sullied. Travelling so far and yet not taking Gloucester would impact on the respect and prestige accorded to him, about which he was notoriously sensitive. Based on reconnaissance, Charles's officers were confident that the garrison's food and ammunition would not last long. They argued that the city could be taken in less than 10 days, with Parliament lacking an effective army to relieve the city. If Essex's forces did not attack, the Royalists would take the city. If they did attack, they would be exhausted and, according to Royalist intelligence, far weaker than the Oxford army, allowing Charles to destroy Parliament's one remaining significant force. Under the direct command of the Earl of Forth, the Royalists laid siege to the city. Rupert had suggested a direct assault, but this proposal was not adopted due to fears of high casualties. By the 11th of August, the Royalist trenches were dug and the artillery prepared, despite Massey's attempts to disrupt work with musket fire. To this end, Massey ordered raids under the cover of darkness, with James Harkness, his second-in-command, leading a raid on the artillery trenches. In revenge, the Royalists attacked the east of the city, but were driven off by cannon fire. 12 August saw more raids, this time during the day, which cost the Royalists 10 men and a supply depot, with no parliamentarian losses. Despite this, the assaults did not disrupt Royalist preparations, and by the evening they were able to start bombarding the town. By the 24th of August, the Royalists, suffering from shortfalls in their stocks of gunpowder and cannonballs, remained unable to breach the walls. Essex, in the meantime, had been urgently preparing his army, which, thanks to disease, indiscipline and desertion, numbered less than 6,000 infantry and 3,500 cavalry. This was not a force strong enough to defeat the Royalists, and so he demanded an extra 5,000 soldiers. Parliamentarians in London responded by enlisting the London trained bands, which provided an additional 6,000 men. Taking into account additional problems and desertions, the eventual force was 9,000 foot soldiers and 5,000 cavalry. After being mustered on Hounslow Heath, the army began marching towards Aylesbury, arriving on the 28th of August. This force was formally mustered on the 30th of August, and after being reinforced by Lord Grey on the 1st of September at Brackley, marched to Gloucester. On the 5th of September, with heavy rain falling, the Parliamentarian army reached the town and camped on Prestbury Hill. Immediately outside it, the presence forced the Royalists to abandon the siege, given that neither army, wet and exhausted, was in a state to seek battle. Pursued Charles's cautious failure to directly assault the town, putting a higher priority on minimizing losses than on victory, had cost the Royalists dearly. While claims for their number of dead and wounded men ranged from 1,000 to 1,500, only around 50 people inside the city were killed. Essex's force, on the other hand, was in relatively good shape. Its one issue was the lack of supplies. If he stayed in the Severn Valley, Essex would be unable to get reinforcements or outside aid. The London elements of the army would demand to go home, and the one remaining significant parliamentarian force would find itself pinned down, while Charles, with secure bases at Oxford and Bristol, would be able to starve them into surrender while other Royalist armies ran rampant through Britain. Because of this, Essex had no choice but to try to return to London, travelling back across the Cotswolds, as he had done to reach Gloucester initially, would expose the parliamentarians to Charles's cavalry on open ground. The first alternative was to march southeast to the River Kennet and cross it, going through Newbury and returning to Reading's fortifications, thus evading the Royalists and allowing for a safe retreat to London. The disadvantage to this was the time it would take to cross the relatively open land between Essex's position and the Kennet. If Essex was able to cross to the west bank of the River Avon, he could secure the bridges across it and prevent the Royalists from crossing it and confronting his army. His cavalry advanced to Upton to screen the main force from Royalist interference on the 11th of September, with the rest of the soldiers quickly following. The Royalists finally began to march on the 16th of September, with Rupert's cavalry streaming ahead to try to disrupt the parliamentarian retreat. By the 18th of September, Rupert's force had caught up to the parliamentarians outside Aldbin. Essex had lost his advantage. Parliamentarian intelligence reports had convinced him that Charles was heading towards Oxford and had given up the campaign. In fact, Charles was barely 14 miles away. But the complacency such reports induced meant that one contemporary source stated the parliamentarians were marching barely 5 miles a day, allowing the Royalists to quickly catch up. Suitably chastened by the discovery of his error, Essex increased the pace of his retreat, with the Royalists pursuing closely. Both sides were heading for Newbury, on roughly parallel routes. The Royalists' route took him through Farringdon and Wantage, increasing the distance they would have to travel to 30 miles, while the parliamentarians had to travel only 20. Charles reacted by dispatching Rupert and 7,000 cavalry in a flying column to disrupt and harass the parliamentary retreat. Encountering Essex's forces at Aldburn Chase, Rupert made battle, however, lacking enough troops to engage the parliamentarians directly. He instead attacked a section of their army, causing chaos and crucially delaying Essex's march just enough for Charles's forces to close the gap. The effect of Rupert's actions, even after his forces disengaged, was to force another delay in the parliamentarian retreat. Essex spent much of the 19th of September looking after wounded soldiers, and when he finally managed to begin moving again, he was confronted with swampland and bog which further delayed him while the Royalists marched across the relatively open chalk downs above the Kennet. These hardships meant that the Royalists arrived at Newbury before Essex, with both armies settling down for the night outside the town, too exhausted to immediately fight. Newbury landscape. The landscape of the area around Newbury was a significant factor in the tactics of both sides during the resulting battle. Though the land was mostly open country, a crescent-shaped escarpment known as Biggs Hill sat between the Royalist and parliamentarian forces. To either side of Essex's army lay open fields, while the battlefield was bracketed by the River Kennet on one side and the River Enbourne on the other, which neither side attempted to cross on foot. Essex's most obvious route of advance was to push past the Royalist forces, secure the bridge and return to London. Unfortunately, the open area approaching the bridge was of killing ground. Soldiers would be entirely in the open and forced to march no more than 6 abreast, which would prevent Essex effectively deploying against a Royalist attack and leave the parliamentarians' forces bunched up and subject to artillery fire. Even if Essex managed to cross the bridge, the other side of the river featured several hundred meters of waterlogged ground, which would slow his soldiers and leave them open to attack while necessitating the abandonment of the parliamentarian artillery. A major humiliation for a 17th-century army. The only alternative to a bridge-based retreat would be to bypass Newbury completely by marching around the Royalists. But this would again involve moving through open fields and subjecting Essex's soldiers to the attacks of Royalist cavalry, who were described as greatly outnumbering the parliamentarian cavalry. Confronting the Royalists directly would involve moving into ground described as containing dense copses and innumerable banked hedges with ditches, flanking fields and lining sunken lanes. While this would allow the troops to move in a concealed fashion, it would also make deployment difficult, and the numerous lanes would restrict movement in the heat of battle. Order of battle. There are no definitive orders of battle for Newbury. As official contemporary evidence is thin, it is possible to glean some information from both later official reports and contemporary accounts, which allow for a reconstruction of the likely disposition of each force. The Royalists were led by Charles I personally, with William Vavasour commanding the right wing, Prince Rupert the left. and Sir John Byron the centre. Artillery support consisted of 20 cannons in total, 6 heavy, 6 medium and 8 light. Initial Royalist and Parliamentarian estimates were of a force of around 17,000 men. Modern estimates are of around 7,500 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Essex led the Parliamentarians, commanding both the entire force and, separately, the right wing. The left wing was commanded by Philip Stapleton. Artillery support was provided by 2 heavy cannons and around 20 light cannons. Most of the heavy artillery was left at Gloucester to help defend the city. Estimates as to the total number of men vary between 7,000 and 15,000. John Barrett, noting the losses at Gloucester, estimates that Essex's force totaled around 14,000 men, with 6,000 cavalry and dragoons and 8,000 infantry.